It was a crisp Tuesday morning in the small, quiet town of Ridgeview. Sarah Robinson, a woman known for her determination and dedication to her small business, was driving through town on her usual errands. The morning sun was still low, casting a golden hue over the streets. As Sarah hummed softly to a song playing on the radio, she had just dropped off a few supplies at her store and was heading home for a quick lunch when everything changed. Without warning, the flashing blue and red lights of a police car appeared in her rearview mirror. The siren sounded briefly as Sarah pulled over to the side of the road. Confused, she glanced at the officer who had just parked behind her. The officer was young, not much older than Sarah's younger brother, Marcus. She had seen him around town, but didn't know much about him. Officer Greg Hartley was known for his strict and no-nonsense approach to law enforcement, but Sarah had never had a reason to interact with him until now. She sat in the car for a moment, taking a deep breath and adjusting her rearview mirror. She had always prided herself on being careful and responsible with her car. It was old but well-maintained. She had noticed a small issue with her taillight the night before but hadn't gotten around to fixing it, yet she wasn't worried about it since she hadn't seen any signs of trouble with the car, and it seemed like a minor problem. But now, as she watched Officer Hartley step out of his vehicle and approach her, she felt a wave of anxiety wash over her, rolling down the window. She gave him a polite smile, but his expression remained stern. He asked her for her license and registration, and Sarah quickly handed them over, trying to remain calm. She mentioned the taillight, explaining that it had just gone out, and she had planned to fix it that afternoon. Officer Hartley didn't acknowledge her explanation. Instead, he glanced at the taillight briefly and then back at her with a disapproving look. Without warning, he wrote her a ticket. The fine was steep, far higher than Sarah had expected, especially for something as minor as a broken taillight. Sarah's heart sank as the officer handed her the ticket and advised her to take care of the issue within a week. She thanked him quietly and watched as he turned and walked back to his patrol car, feeling a mix of disbelief and frustration. As she pulled away from the curb, Sarah glanced at the ticket in her hand. Still unable to fully process what had just happened, she had been polite and respectful. She had even tried to explain the situation, and yet she had been treated as though she were a criminal for something so insignificant. Her thoughts raced as she drove back home. She knew that her next steps would be crucial. She couldn't just let this go without addressing it, but she wasn't sure how to fight something as seemingly small as a traffic ticket. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. Something about the way Officer Hartley had acted felt personal, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it, and she certainly had no idea that this moment would soon set off a chain of events that would change everything in her town forever. The courthouse in Ridgeview was a small but sturdy building, nestled between the town's library and the old diner where locals gathered every morning for coffee. Sarah had been there a handful of times before, but always for minor matters, small claims, or local council meetings. She never imagined that a simple traffic ticket would bring her here, especially not under such tense circumstances. When she arrived, the usual quiet of the town seemed to be replaced with an unfamiliar hum of tension. The courthouse was filled with people, some standing in the hallway, others sitting nervously in the waiting area, whispering to each other about the case of Sarah Robinson. Her name had already become a topic of discussion. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was even heavier. The wooden floors creaked under the shuffle of feet, and the air felt thick with anticipation. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in the room was watching her. Judge Lawrence Miller sat at the front, an older man with a stern face and a reputation for strict rulings. He had been in Ridgeview for as long as anyone could remember, and his decisions were often seen as final. There was a certain gravity to his presence that made people nervous, and Sarah was no exception. Her fingers fidgeted with the edges of the ticket in her hand as she took a seat in the defendant's chair. She glanced around the room at the other faces. Most of them were familiar. The sheriff sat off to the side, flipping through paperwork, while a few of her friends from the local community were in attendance as well, offering her silent support. It was clear that the whole town had turned out for this hearing. Some were curious, some were skeptical, but Sarah could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. When Judge Miller called the case, his voice boomed across the room. "Sarah Robinson, you are charged with a traffic violation for a broken taillight. How do you plead?" His words were sharp, and there was little warmth in his tone. Sarah stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to keep her composure, but the nervous energy in her body made it hard to stay calm. "Not guilty, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but quiet. The judge nodded and motioned for her to explain. Sarah began to recount the events of the morning, the traffic stop, her explanation about the broken taillight, and the officer's decision to issue the fine despite her attempts to offer a reasonable explanation. She knew the fine was excessive, especially for something so minor, but she also knew that in a town like Ridgeview, it wasn't always easy to challenge authority. Judge Miller listened attentively, his gaze never leaving her. When she finished, there was a long pause. Sarah felt as though the entire room was waiting for his decision. After a moment of silence, the judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Guilty," he said without hesitation. "The fine is $500, payable within 7 days." Sarah was stunned. The words seemed to echo in her ears, drowning out the sounds of the courtroom. She had expected a warning, maybe a reduced fine, but this was a harsh sentence for a broken taillight. As she stood there, her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts: anger, disbelief, frustration. The ticket she had received was no longer just about a minor traffic violation. It had become something far more significant. The crowd in the courtroom remained silent, and Sarah could feel the weight of their eyes on her. She swallowed hard and nodded, accepting the ruling, but inside she was seething. It was clear now that this wasn't just about the ticket. There was something more at play here, something that Sarah would need to figure out. And this was only the beginning. After the court session, Sarah left the courthouse with a mixture of disbelief and anger swirling inside her. The $500 fine felt like more than just a punishment for a broken taillight. It felt like an attack on her. She had tried to stay composed in front of Judge Miller, but the sting of his dismissal of her defense, the way he had so quickly deemed her guilty, stayed with her long after she walked out of the courthouse. The streets of Ridgeview, usually so familiar and comforting, now seemed cold and distant. Sarah's thoughts were racing as she drove home, her mind replaying the events of the morning. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the fine. It was how easily Judge Miller had dismissed her explanation, how indifferent he had seemed. Something about the way he treated her felt personal, even though she couldn't pinpoint why. When she arrived home, Sarah tossed the ticket onto her kitchen counter and sank into a chair, her head in her hands. She needed to figure out what had really happened in that courtroom. Her first instinct was to let it go, to pay the fine and move on. But deep down, she knew she couldn't. This wasn't just about a ticket. It was about something larger, something that had been simmering beneath the surface of Ridgeview for a long time. She just didn't know what it was yet. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from her older brother, Marcus Robinson, the mayor of Ridgeview. He had been following the case, and she could tell from the tone of his message that he was concerned. Asterisk, asterisk, you okay? I just heard about what happened in court. Call me when you can. We need to talk. Asterisk, asterisk. Sarah hesitated for a moment before picking up the phone and dialing her brother's number. Marcus answered almost immediately, his voice laced with concern. "Sarah, what happened?" he asked. "I'm hearing some things, and I'm not happy about it." She sighed and told him everything about the traffic stop, the ticket, and the way Judge Miller had ruled without hesitation. She explained how she had felt dismissed and unfairly judged, despite offering a reasonable explanation. Marcus was silent for a long moment, and Sarah could hear him muttering under his breath as he processed what she had said. "Sarah, I'm sorry this happened," Marcus finally said, "but we need to get to the bottom of this. I don't like how quickly that judgment came down. I know Judge Miller, and this is not like him. He's usually more reasonable." Sarah was taken aback. She had never thought of Marcus as someone who would question the authority of the local judges, especially not publicly. But the more they talked, the more Sarah began to realize that this wasn't just about her and Judge Miller. There was something deeper here. The way the whole town was talking about her case, the way people seemed so quick to judge, it felt like something had been brewing beneath the surface of Ridgeview for years, and now it was coming to a head. Marcus's voice grew more determined. I'm going to look into this. Something's not right, Sarah. I'll get back to you soon. After hanging up, Sarah sat in silence for a long time. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she felt a flicker of hope that her brother would be able to uncover something. There was a growing sense in her chest, a feeling that this fight was bigger than she had first thought. It wasn't just about a fine or a broken taillight anymore. It was about something much deeper, something that needed to be addressed before it consumed the whole town. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah knew she couldn't sit idly by. She had to find out more, even if it meant digging into the town's secrets. Ridgeview had always felt like a small, peaceful place, but now it was starting to feel like a town on the edge. And Sarah had a feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger. The days following the court ruling were a blur for Sarah. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong in Ridgeview, something hidden beneath the town's picture-perfect facade. While she tried to continue with her daily routine, working at her store and running errands, she found herself distracted, constantly thinking about the $500 fine and Judge Miller's harsh decision. Every time she passed the courthouse or saw the familiar blue lights of a police car, a sense of unease crept up on her. The incident quickly became the talk of Ridgeview, and Sarah realized that her case wasn't just about a broken taillight anymore. People were beginning to rally behind her, some out of genuine concern for what had happened, and others because they saw an opportunity to fight back against what they perceived as an unjust system. By the end of the week, word had spread throughout the town, and the issue had sparked protests. Sarah had not planned for this kind of attention, but it was clear that something had struck a nerve. Her phone was ringing off the hook, messages and calls pouring in from activists, community leaders, and even some old friends who had heard about the case. Some called it a racial issue, others spoke about the unfairness of the fine, and a few suggested that the judge's behavior was indicative of a larger problem in the town's justice system. Despite the support, Sarah felt conflicted. She didn't want to be seen as a victim or used as a symbol in a larger fight, but she couldn't deny that there was a growing sense that something needed to change. One evening, as Sarah sat at her kitchen table sorting through the messages, her phone buzzed again. It was Marcus. "Sarah, we need to talk," Marcus said, his voice sounding unusually urgent. "Meet me at my office in 20 minutes. Sarah felt a chill run through her. There was something in his tone that made her realize this wasn't just about the ticket anymore. Marcus had always been calm and collected, but now he sounded like he was in the middle of something important. She quickly grabbed her keys and drove to City Hall, wondering what she was about to hear. When she arrived at her brother's office, he was standing by the window, looking out at the town below. His face was drawn, and he didn't turn when she walked in. The weight of the situation hung in the air like a thick fog. "Marcus, what's going on?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with concern. Marcus turned slowly, his eyes filled with determination. "I've been looking into Judge Miller's history," he said, "and there's something you need to know." Sarah's heart raced as she listened intently. Marcus explained that, over the years, Judge Miller had been known for making harsh decisions, particularly against people from marginalized communities. While many had suspected bias, no one had ever been able to prove it. Marcus had spoken to a few local activists and discovered a pattern of unfair rulings, some of which seemed to disproportionately affect people of color. The case against Sarah was the latest in a string of questionable decisions, but it was the first time someone had challenged it publicly. "I think Miller might be more than just a biased judge, Sarah," Marcus continued. "He might be part of a larger system that's been protecting him for years. People have been afraid to speak up, but now that you're in the spotlight, I think we can do something about it." Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had known that her case wasn't just about a fine, but hearing the truth from her brother hit her hard. There was no way she could ignore what was happening now. The protests, the growing public unrest, it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure Ridgeview changed, that people like Judge Miller couldn't continue to get away with treating others unfairly. "We can't let this go," Sarah said quietly, her voice filled with resolve. "I'm not going to be silent anymore. If this town wants change, we're going to have to fight for it." Marcus nodded, his expression softening. I'm with you, Sarah, but we'll need support. We need to expose what's been happening here, and we need to do it the right way. This isn't just about a traffic ticket, it's about something much bigger. With a newfound sense of purpose, Sarah knew that this was only the beginning. The battle ahead would be long and the road would be tough, but for the first time since the incident, she felt ready to face whatever came next. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for her community, for the truth, and for the kind of town she wanted Ridgeview to become. And nothing, not even the power of Judge Miller, would stop her. The following days brought a whirlwind of activity that Sarah hadn't anticipated. The pressure from the growing protests, media attention, and local outcry weighed heavily on her. People from all walks of life were reaching out: supporters, critics, curious onlookers, and even those who had lived in Ridgeview for years but had never been vocal about injustices. One that started as a simple traffic ticket was now a symbol of something much larger. Sarah was no longer just fighting a fine. She was caught in a larger battle for fairness and justice. But as the town's protests swelled, something unexpected happened. Her brother Marcus, the mayor of Ridgeview, became more involved. His quiet investigation into Judge Miller's past had uncovered disturbing patterns. Marcus had discovered that Miller's judicial decisions were far from unbiased. There were several cases of questionable rulings, fines that disproportionately targeted certain groups in the town. His actions suggested that he had been part of a quiet, unspoken system of favoritism that had protected him for years. The thought made Sarah's stomach churn. She knew it wasn't just about the broken taillight anymore. As Sarah prepared to head to another protest rally, her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. It simply read, ***, he found something. You need to come to my office now. ***, her heart skipped a beat. She dropped everything and made her way to City Hall, her mind racing with questions. What had Marcus discovered? Was it enough to bring down Judge Miller? When she arrived at Marcus's office, the door was already ajar, and she could hear him speaking on the phone. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. Marcus was pacing the room, his face tense and his voice low. *'I'll call you back," he said into the phone and hung up quickly when he saw Sarah. *'Come in. We need to talk." Sarah closed the door behind her and sat down, her curiosity piqued. Marcus didn't waste time. He pulled out a file and slid it across the desk to her. "This is what I've been able to dig up on Judge Miller. It's worse than we thought." Sarah opened the file, scanning the documents in front of her. She found a series of case files detailing previous rulings by Judge Miller, cases that had been ignored, dismissed, or ruled unfairly. But one particular case stood out. A young black man named Terrence Johnson had been fined for a minor offense, just like Sarah. The fine was far beyond the norm, and what was more alarming was the way Judge Miller had dismissed Terrence's explanation without question. There were also accounts from other residents who claimed Miller had been far harsher with people of color, making decisions without regard for fairness. "This is systematic," Marcus said, his voice tight. "It's been happening for years, and nobody's dared to speak out. People in power have been covering for him, but now we have evidence. We can't ignore this." Sarah was in shock, but she also felt a spark of determination ignite within her. She knew this was it. This was the proof she had been looking for. Proof that Judge Miller's behavior wasn't a one-time mistake, but part of a pattern that had been affecting the entire community. This wasn't just her fight anymore. This was about exposing the injustice that had been hidden for far too long. "I'm not going to back down," Sarah said firmly. "We can't just sit on this information. We need to go public, Marcus. We need to tell the town what's been happening." Marcus nodded. "I agree. But we have to be careful. We can't rush this. We need to get the support of the community, especially the local activists. We need to be strategic." Sarah took a deep breath, her mind racing with the possibilities. The protests had already stirred the pot, but now she had the evidence to back it up. With her brother's position as mayor and the growing support from the community, they could take on Judge Miller and the corrupt system that had been protecting him. The weight of what they were about to do settled on her shoulders, but for the first time since the incident, Sarah felt like she was on the right path. This fight wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about making sure that the town of Ridgeview, her home, lived up to the values of fairness, justice, and equality. And no one, not even the judge, could stand in their way. The days after Sarah's meeting with Marcus felt like they were building towards something monumental. The tension in Ridgeview was palpable. What had started as a fight over a broken taillight had turned into a full-scale battle for justice, and now, with evidence in hand, Sarah felt more determined than ever to take action. But Marcus was right. They needed to be strategic. This wasn't just about making noise. It was about making a real, lasting impact. Every move had to be carefully calculated. The first step was to rally the community. Sarah and Marcus knew that without the support of local residents, they stood little chance of exposing the corruption that had been festering in Ridgeview for so long. They had to show the people of the town that this wasn't just a personal vendetta, it was about fairness, equality, and the kind of community they wanted to be. Marcus organized a town hall meeting, a chance for people to voice their concerns and learn about the evidence they had uncovered. Sarah was both nervous and excited as the day of the meeting approached. She had seen the support grow in the days since her court hearing, but she also knew that many people in Ridgeview were reluctant to challenge the status quo. The town had always been small and tight-knit, and some were content with the way things had always been. The night of the meeting, Sarah arrived early, walking into the community center where the event was being held. The large room was filled with folding chairs, each one slowly filling with people. Sarah could see the familiar faces of old friends, neighbors, and business owners, but there were also new faces, activists and organizers who had come in from outside Ridgeview to support her cause. The atmosphere was charged, and Sarah could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Marcus stood at the front, addressing the crowd. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice carrying a sense of urgency. What we're facing here in Ridgeview is more than just one incident. It's about the system that's been in place for years, one that has allowed injustice to thrive in our community. Sarah's case, as upsetting as it is just the tip of the iceberg. The room was quiet as Marcus continued. He spoke about the evidence they had uncovered, about Judge Miller's history of biased rulings and the pattern of unfair fines and decisions that had disproportionately affected marginalized people. Sarah could see the shock on the faces of many in the crowd. Some were angry, some were confused, but many were nodding in agreement. It was clear that people were ready to confront the truth, even if it meant challenging the long-standing power structures in their town. When Marcus finished, Sarah stood up. She had prepared a short speech, but as she looked out at the sea of faces, she felt a rush of emotion. This wasn't just about her. It was about all of them, the people of Ridgeview and the future they wanted to create together. "I didn't ask for this," she began, her voice shaking at first. "All I wanted was to go about my day and run my business. But what happened to me in that courtroom opened my eyes to something bigger. Something we've all been turning a blind eye to. We can't let this continue. I'm not just fighting for me. I'm fighting for all of us, for fairness, for justice." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sarah took a deep breath before continuing. "We deserve to live in a town where everyone is treated equally, no matter their race, their income, or their background. We deserve a system where power isn't used to protect the few at the expense of the many, and we're not going to stop until we get that." The room erupted into applause, and Sarah felt a surge of hope flood her chest. This was it. The fight was just beginning, but now, for the first time, it felt like they had the support they needed to make a real change. As the evening wore on, more people came forward to share their own stories. Stories of unfair treatment, biased decisions, and the feeling that the system had been stacked against them for years. The sense of solidarity in the room was overwhelming. Sarah knew that this was only the beginning, but she also knew that with the support of the community, they could make a difference. The next day, as Sarah walked out of her store, she saw something she hadn't expected. A group of people gathered outside, holding signs that read "Justice for Sarah," "End Corruption," and "Fairness for All." The movement was gaining momentum, and Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about a broken taillight anymore. It was about fighting for what was right, and Ridgeview was ready for change. The momentum from the town hall meeting had shifted the energy in Ridgeview. What had once been a small-scale protest had now blossomed into a full-blown movement. Every day, Sarah saw new faces joining the growing movement for justice, and every evening, the streets were filled with signs demanding change. The people of Ridgeview were no longer just spectators. They were becoming active participants in this fight. Sarah could feel the tide turning, but with every gain, there was a growing sense of urgency. It was clear that they were about to face even more resistance, especially from the powerful figures who had kept things as they were for so long. The next step in their plan was clear. They needed to take their case to the state level. Marcus had already reached out to legal experts and civil rights organizations, and he was in talks with local politicians who could help amplify their cause. It wasn't going to be easy, and Sarah knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. But she also knew that there was no turning back. As the protest continued to swell, the town of Ridgeview found itself divided. There were those who supported the movement wholeheartedly, those who remained loyal to Judge Miller, and those who were simply unsure of what to believe. The media coverage had amplified the divide, with the town becoming a battleground for opinions on what was right and fair. Local businesses, including Sarah's store, had become symbols of this larger fight. Some customers walked away, unwilling to support a business tied to what they saw as a controversial cause, while others voiced their approval and became regular patrons. Despite the tension, Sarah remained resolute. Each morning, she woke up with the weight of the movement on her shoulders, but each night, she went to bed knowing that change was slowly but surely taking shape. The pressure on Judge Miller was mounting. Public opinion was shifting, and the more the community spoke out, the more difficult it became for the powers that be to ignore the issue. One afternoon, Sarah sat down with Marcus in his office, reviewing the legal strategy they had been working on. They had gathered testimonies, collected records, and built a case that couldn't be ignored. The truth was coming to light, and it wasn't just about one judge. It was about the deeply ingrained system of favoritism and inequality that had existed in Ridgeview for decades. "We have the evidence," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "But we need more. If we're going to expose Miller and hold him accountable, we need to make sure the state government takes this seriously. We need public pressure." "I know," Sarah replied, feeling the weight of their next move. "But the people are with us. This isn't just about me anymore. This is about everyone who's ever felt like they weren't heard." As if on cue, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number, but the message sent a jolt of panic through her body. Asterisk, asterisk, we know what you're doing. Back off, or there will be consequences. Asterisk, asterisk. Her heart raced as she read the message again, trying to understand who could have sent it. It wasn't just a threat, it was a warning, and it sent a chill through her. Marcus looked over her shoulder as she stared at the screen. "Is it a prank?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "I don't think so," Sarah said, her fingers trembling as she typed a response. She was tempted to delete the message, to pretend it didn't exist, but she knew better. This was real. This was the pushback they had been expecting, but now it felt much closer, much more personal. Marcus took a deep breath, his face hardening with resolve. "We can't let this intimidate us. This is the fight of our lives. We keep pushing forward." Sarah nodded, but deep down, she knew this was a turning point. They had crossed the line, and the powers that had once controlled the town were not going to give up without a fight. The stakes had just been raised. The message was clear: if they didn't back down, things could get ugly. But Sarah wasn't afraid. This was no longer just a fight for justice. It was a fight for the future of Ridgeview. As Sarah looked at the message one last time, she made a decision. She wasn't going to back off. The movement was bigger than her now, and the people who stood with her deserved to see this through to the end. Ridgeview had always been her home, and she was ready to see it change for the better, no matter the cost. The battle for justice had only just begun, and Sarah was more determined than ever to win it. The following weeks were the most intense and challenging of Sarah's life. As the pressure mounted, Ridgeview became a haunt of tension, divided between those supporting the movement for justice and those loyal to Judge Miller. The streets were filled with protesters chanting for fairness, while local officials and law enforcement quietly worked behind the scenes to protect the judge's position. Sarah's life, once peaceful and predictable, had turned into a whirlwind of rallies, meetings, and late-night strategy sessions with Marcus. The anonymous threats had continued, escalating in both frequency and intensity. Sarah received more cryptic messages warning her to back down. Some were simply unsettling. Others hinted at direct harm if she didn't stop her fight. She couldn't help but feel the weight of the danger they were facing. But as the days passed, the anger she felt about the corruption in her town only grew. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about all the people who had suffered in silence for far too long. One evening, as Sarah and Marcus sat at his desk, reviewing legal documents in a dimly lit office, the phone rang. Marcus answered it immediately, his eyes locking with Sarah as he listened intently. "They're going to do it," Marcus said, hanging up the phone and rubbing his face in frustration. "The state's attorney general is going to officially investigate Judge Miller. This could be the break we've been waiting for." A wave of relief washed over Sarah, but it was quickly followed by a sense of caution. They weren't out of the woods yet. The investigation was a significant victory, but the fight wasn't over. They still needed to maintain public pressure, keep the movement going, and ensure that Judge Miller didn't use his influence to escape consequences. As the news spread that an official investigation was underway, the town's atmosphere shifted once again. Ridgeview was on edge, but there was a renewed sense of hope in the air. Protesters marched daily, but now they weren't just calling for Sarah's case to be overturned. They were demanding accountability for every unfair ruling, for every life affected by the injustice that had been allowed to fester. A week later, Marcus received an unexpected phone call. The state's attorney general wanted to meet in person, a clear sign that they were taking the investigation seriously. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the chance to make sure the truth came to light and that Ridgeview's broken system was held accountable. The meeting was set for the following day. Sarah felt a nervous excitement bubble up inside her as she and Marcus prepared for the conversation. This was more than just a victory for her. It was a victory for every resident who had ever felt powerless, every person who had ever been silenced or ignored by those in power. The next morning, as Sarah stood with Marcus outside City Hall, she was met with the sight of dozens of people gathered outside in support, their signs raised high and their voices strong. The community had come together, unified in a cause greater than themselves. The state's attorney general had arrived, and the meeting was about to begin. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Sarah and Marcus sat across from the attorney general and a group of state officials. They presented their case, laying out the evidence against Judge Miller, testimonies from people who had been wronged, the historical pattern of biased rulings, and the mounting public pressure. For the first time, it felt like the system was listening. After hours of intense discussion, the Attorney General stood up. "We've heard your case, and we're going to do everything in our power to ensure that justice is served," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Judge Miller's actions have been reckless, and they will be investigated thoroughly. We will make sure that the people of Ridgeview get the justice they deserve." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she exchanged a look with Marcus. It was a moment of triumph, but it was also just the beginning. The investigation would take time, and there was still much work to be done. But Sarah knew that Ridgeview had changed forever. The town was no longer a place where people had to accept corruption and injustice in silence. Now, it was a place where people fought for what was right, and won. As Sarah stepped outside with Marcus, she looked at the crowd gathered in front of City Hall. The signs still waved proudly in the air. The fight had been long, and it had been hard, but it was a fight they had won together. Ridgeview had found its voice, and nothing could ever silence it again.